The reason that I'm calling this debate at this time is that Gloucestershire remains now, in the southwest, the only authority where there either isn't unitary government in part of the area or there isn't a move towards unitary government. Now, I've long believed that unitary authorities are the way forward in local government. I've got a long track history of so doing. I've been a councillor for many years, and all the time when I was twin hatting, if you like, or triple hatting, because I've always been a member of a parish and town council. All the time I was a district councillor and a county councillor. I've always believed that the primary authority should be one body. So that's why I'm bringing forward this debate. The one thing that was left out of the particular issue I brought forward was the question mark at the end of it. Now, I know the authorities in the House don't like question marks, but I deliberately had a question mark at the end of it because there is a real question mark about where we go to and where we've come from in terms of local government in Gloucestershire. I've got three main parts to where I think the debate should be going to, and the reason I'm calling for it this time. First, as already intimated, every other part of the southwest now, let alone other parts of the country, are now moving towards unitary local government. And I think it's about time Gloucestershire grasped the nettle. But there are two more substantive points which I want to elaborate upon. Secondly, we've got real financial constraints within the County of Gloucestershire at the moment. The 7 different authorities, to a greater or lesser extent, have now got real financial burdens, which has come about on the back of austerity. Now, I'm not going to labour that point, but it is now at a crunch time so that we have to consider all options. And the third point is that, to my mind, we need a strategic authority which speaks for those who live within the County of Gloucestershire, and I'm not going to remove the County of Gloucestershire, but we need to recognise that we need local government to speak with a much more coherent and coordinated voice than currently is the case. I'm not going to call for a specific reform today. That's for there to be a proper consultation upon. That's for councillors to lead that consultation. There are many ideas that have come forward, whether it's a unitary county, which is not my preferred solution, whether we split the west and the east, whether we have the donut with Cheltenham and Gloucester in the middle and a rural authority, including my own, in Stroud around it, or indeed to allow those authorities like Stroud, which could go to South Gloucestershire, an existing local authority, and then see what else happens to the rest of the county. I mean, the reality is we have to do something. And what I'll be calling for at the end is for the Minister to look at ways in which he can both encourage and, dare I say, cajole those who make decisions within Gloucestershire to consider how we can move forward in this respect. So, to build on that case then, every other authority now is looking at some form of unitary arrangement within the 7 counties of the southwest. It's important that we consider it, but at the moment there is no mechanism. There's the leaders get together, the chief executives get together, but they do not have any authority to move forward in terms of bringing this debate to a proper conclusion, which I believe will result in local authorities choosing the unitary route with the support of the people. In terms of the financial case, I just look at some of the figures I've obtained about the funding now of unitary authorities compared to places where, like Gloucestershire, it's currently 2-tier. And there is a marked demarcation that, at the moment, the government seems to be encouraging unitary authorities just because the finance seems to be following that. Now, I know under the previous not the previous, but the previous Secretary of State, the recently ennobled Lord Pickles, there was a clear view that unitisation was not the way forward, but I'm pleased to see that the current Secretary of State is much more open to it. To quote what he said in the Local Government Chronicle in May 2018, he said, "There is a clear space and scope for unitary authorities. Obviously, it is seeing where there is a need for that, and yes, there are proposals on the table that my predecessor has been considering, and I will now be looking at. Now, I take that to be a green light. I'm not saying that it necessarily it's going to day will follow night, but there is a clear view that the government now believes that unitary authorities are the way forward. And the simple fact is I do not know an example of a unitary authority, bar Torbay, over its funding issues, that wishes to go back to some form of two-tier. The direction of change is obvious. So the finance suggests it. The way in which that is imposing upon us. Now, I could moan about the way Stroud District Council has had no funding through the rate support grant on this occasion. But I'm very pleased that the government have offered Gloucestershire the opportunity of the business rates initiative. And so we have moved forward. And that has demanded a degree of collaboration amongst our authorities. So the government, again, is pushing in terms of finance. And the final point I would make under the issue of finance is just the attitudes of some of the staff who happen to work for two-tier local authorities. Now, Unison conducted a survey of its members in Stroud District Council, and the figures of what those employees were saying was very stark. 80% were not confident about the future of local services under the current arrangements. None felt that vulnerable local residents were safely cared for. 60% were not confident the financial situation of their employer, Stroud District Council. And 53% were thinking about leaving their job for something less stressful. Now, the fact is, we currently are sadly laying off some very good staff who are the bedrock of local government. They've served Stroud for generations, and that's all down to the cuts. But it's all down to the fact we've got the wrong arrangement in place in Gloucestershire in terms of our local government. To come on to the strategic case, I mean, the main problem is, dare I say, with 7 authorities, there isn't much obvious strategy. What goes on because of the pressures from outside rather than a clear directional movement because of the decision-making within the county itself. Now, the County Council has, dare I say, severe problems. It's currently facing ongoing inspection of its children's services, where it's deemed inadequate last year. I'm pleased to say in the latest letter which I've received, 8th of June, there is some improvement, but again, it is still subject to an ongoing investigation. Yesterday, it faced the resignation of its chief fire officer. I don't know the full details of that, but again, it does seem to have a degree of crisis associated with it. And then again, my favourite topic, the incinerator, being built at great expense, £500 million. I would argue it's an entirely dubious case has been brought forward by the County Council for incinerating its waste, both in terms of the cost, but also in terms of the environmental impact and indeed some of the health implications, which I'll be talking about in the future. So, Gloucestershire needs to move forward. It needs to see how it can address its own issues by embracing change. Now, we did go almost through this process some time ago. The only thing that shocked me is that I remember the Widdicombe investigation back in the mid-80s. Probably the chairman might well remember them as well, but there are other people here who probably wouldn't even know what the Widdicombe investigation was. And this was an idea of looking at, and certainly the minister's eyes are glazing over now, this was an attempt under a Conservative government to look at the way in which local government could be reframed. It wasn't about unitary local government per se, it was about the way in which services could be provided in a different way. Now, all I remember about the Widdicombe report is in Gloucestershire, we didn't adopt any change whatsoever, and in fact, it ended up as a bloodbath between every councillor attacking every other councillor because they felt their authority should be the most important one within their particular area, and therefore, there was no meeting the minds at all. Now, all I would say to the Minister, I don't want to go through another Widdicombe. What I would like to see is pressure from the government in the nicest possible way to say to places like Gloucestershire, you have to consider the options now. We know what's happened in Northamptonshire. We know what's happening in a more voluntary sense. places like Leicestershire, which are considering the options. We know what's happened, as I say, elsewhere in the southwest, where there has been this very clear directional shift. And councillors have been grown up enough to recognise the only way they can deal with their financial pressures is to look at some form of amalgamation where they can at least deal with the back office costs and the pressures that that brings, but more particularly this strong strategic direction is in line with the way in which I hope the government can see us going. So I'm now going to give the Minister an awful lot of time to explain, and I'm sure he won't mind if I intervene occasionally just to prompt him. But the two questions are of the Minister. I mean, firstly, without a top-down demand, what is the government's approach to unitisation in the sense that is there an encouragement, both in terms of finance, in terms of the strategic service delivery pressures that the government could bring to bear to encourage local authorities like Gloucestershire, which have been laggards in this whole process? So that's the first question. The second question is, a sequitur for that, if you do get parts of the country that refuse, for whatever reason, to consider this option, to consider, not necessarily to go, what will central government do about that? Because we cannot have the situation where every other authority, bar Oxfordshire, which in itself did consider some element of unitary authority, and I gather is also still looking at that. Every other authority in the area has looked at this, and as I said, many have gone along it. We still have relationships, of course, with our LEP, which I have to say in Gloucestershire seems to be performing very well. We've got a unitary police commissioner. We've obviously got a unitary health arrangement through the NHS. So why not local government? So the questions are, how do we do it? And if we don't do it, what is the government prepared to do to help us